Hey everyone, welcome back to Strange New Worlds. I'm your host, Mike Wong. Today on the show, I'm bringing you a discussion I had with my friends over at the Dice in Mind podcast, hosted by Jason Kaufman and Bradley Browne. We're going to chat about space ethics. In particular, a paper I co-authored titled How to Chart a Moral Future for Space Exploration, which I read aloud on the previous episode of Strange New Worlds. If you haven't done so already, you might consider giving that episode a listen so you have the full context for this discussion. Today, Jason, Bradley, and I are going to talk about how I got into space ethics, how my space ethics paper originated and evolved. We're also going to unpack the way I see a multiplicity of moral value in the universe, and what it all means for this present era of space exploration. I always have a blast speaking to these two fellow podcasters, and I know you're going to enjoy it too. If you feel so inclined, I highly recommend subscribing to Dice in Mind. You can find it wherever you get your podcasts. And now, our discussion about morals in space.
Welcome to Dice in Mind, a podcast hosted by Brad Browne and Jason Kaufman to explore the intersection of life, games, science, music, philosophy, and creativity through interviews with leading creatives. All are welcome in this space.
I've gotten used to, actually, let me rephrase that. Over 30 years,
Here it comes.
I've really never, no, I'm going to try that one more time. Very rarely do I feel inferior when having conversations with you.
I would hope not.
Well, no. There are a lot of topics where, there's a lot of topics where you have an educational background and everything like that in areas that obviously, psychology, leadership areas where you've done enormous amounts of research and study and things like that. This really was started to be a joke, but now it became serious.
Yeah, you're really overselling
this really backfired.
It's already hilarious.
Oh, really? Sorry.
Yeah.
Well, ultimately, my point being is that our guest here, this is a gentleman where when we get him on here, I'm almost a little bit starstruck when we had him on the last time, just because of just how intelligent he is and in talking about his background and his expertise and the stories he had on his research and his history and everything like that. So
Yeah.
when you had mentioned an article that had been in Nature and had reached out to see if he would join us again, I was actually excited again. And then I had to do a little bit of research just to make sure that I didn't sound like, I used the term before we hit record to sound like, so I didn't sound like a complete ignoramus.
Yes.
So that when he joins us here shortly, I can actually contribute at least a little bit to the conversation. So,
Well, that's fair. No, I hear you. So, to demystify this for everyone else, we are welcoming returning guest Dr. Michael Wong to Dice in Mind. Mike's been kind enough to chat with us before about writing, about his research, about astrobiology and planetary science. All topics we love and are very adjacent to many of the games we love. I agree. I've been fortunate to write a little bit, to do a little bit of research, but I am, as an academic, a complete poser compared to someone like Mike, who's really quite the Renaissance man. And so Mike and his colleagues published a paper in Nature, as you said, this past July. And for those of you listening who aren't familiar with Nature, Nature is one of the major scientific
Oh
journals
yeah.
on the planet. It's easily in the top four, easily. And so getting anything in there is a big deal. But that's not in and of
You
itself
don't
what
have to
impressed
be.
me.
I mean,
Yeah,
I'm not a scientist.
yeah.
I live in a different world, and I know that nature's a big
Right.
kahuna.
But a lot of
Yeah.
people don't. But a lot
Yeah,
of people,
yeah.
I mean, you're knowledgeable. A lot of people would have no way of knowing that. But we want to make the point that this was in Nature. Now, Nature as a journal, that in and of itself does not impress me. What impresses me is that Mike and his team published an article titled How to Chart a Moral Future for Space Exploration. And I thought, okay, that's so wonderfully adjacent to many of the games we love to think about playing and
As I
to
look at my shelf of Traveler
right. Yeah,
or shelves of Traveler.
Traveler, Star Trek, Star Wars, what else? Paranoia. I mean, the list goes on and on.
Oh yeah.
Uh, yeah, modern age. I mean, it's a long list, people. But this is so interesting, and because it's so that article was so relevant to some of my own scholarship, I thought, okay, this would be fun to talk about with Mike. But it would be really neat through the lens of science fiction because Mike is wonderfully steeped in sci-fi. Through the lens of science fiction and how that is adjacent to role-playing games, sci-fi role-playing games, even and especially, right, RPGs is lit. It would be
Yes.
neat to talk about this with him. Now, the article is behind a firewall or a paywall, I should say, with Nature, because that's just how they roll. But if you can get your hands on it, it's worth reading. It's really quite erudite. It's very philosophically sound, but it's neat. It's really cool, I think, that in 2025, when so many problems have beset the world, especially the United States, that there are people publishing really neat ideas, putting ethics and forethought first, not just about what should we do here now at home, but okay, as humanity inevitably moves out into the solar system and beyond, how do we want to do it?
I just like the fact that people are still thinking about a moral future, especially these days. I
Yes,
hate, and without getting into politics, let's just leave it at that. But
maybe we'll do
um,
better with the next planet.
yeah, yeah, yes. Um, yeah, I said that a little too.
Enthusiastically,
Yeah, yes, yes,
yeah.
yes.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I think it's been a while. I can't remember, and I don't have it up when we had Mike on the last time, but or when you visited Mike's podcast. I know you were on his,
Well, I mean,
you and
we had Mike not so long ago. I mean, that's the funny thing. So, he's been on well, we've had okay, so we had Mike on, and then we played a rerun of our talk with him, and that was just this past July. But last time we
okay,
actually had him on, right, was a couple years ago, actually, right.
right,
And I've been on his podcast once before, and that was a lot of fun. But um, no, but so it's bringing him back, and bringing him back for this kind of reason. This is pretty neat to see thinking like this. You don't have to be a scientist, you don't have to be a scholar, you don't have to have any interest in research. I don't know why you wouldn't, but you don't have to appreciate this is relevant to a lot of the games we play, a lot of the
yeah,
things that many of us who are involved with RPGs directly or indirectly talk about and think about. And so to see it like percolate into circles where maybe this can affect policy, maybe this can affect the future, that's really neat.
yeah, absolutely, it does.
Dr. Michael Wong is an NHFP Sagan postdoctoral fellow at Carnegie Science's Earth and Planets Laboratory, working with Robert M. Hazen and others. His primary scientific interests are planetary atmospheres, habitability, biosignatures, and the emergence of life. He is also co-authoring a revised edition of the textbook Astrobiology: A Multidisciplinary Approach with Professor Jonathan Lunine. His other passions include photography, writing, public speaking, graphic design, and playing a variety of team sports. He hosts a podcast called Strange New Worlds, which examines science, technology, and culture through the lens of Star Trek. All right, well, Mike, thanks so much for coming back. We know why we want to talk to you, but how you doing?
I'm so good. I'm really pleased to be back on the podcast. It's good to see you again, Jason and Brad.
Yeah. No, thank you. So
Yes,
good to see you.
it's
So,
been way too long. We should have had you on earlier, so we apologize for that.
yeah, thanks for being our most recent rerun as well.
Oh,
Yes.
sure. Yeah, of course.
We went back through and we just didn't have that was what early midsummer, Brad.
Yep.
We were both busy. I was traveling and it was like, okay, so what can we run in a pinch that we really enjoyed and that had a lot of listeners? And it was like, oh, we know.
Hmm.
So Mike, I keep seeing you on PBS, which I gotta say, wow.
Hmm.
I gotta say, I'm really impressed. Like you keep popping up in all of these pop and public science venues.
Mm.
So obviously you've got at least two different career paths you could choose here, but
Hmm.
that's not why we brought you on. So this is a little actually this is fairly adjacent for Dice and Mine, but like you've been on before, and we like to riff about stuff, and we're big into RPGs and sci-fi and all that as lit. But once in a while, we like to dabble on the sides, and I saw your paper in Nature,
Mhm.
right, with your colleagues on how to chart a moral future for space exploration. And I
Yeah.
thought, yeah, I mean, look at the grin. I thought, okay, like we know that you are this rarity of really a Renaissance man or a Renaissance individual, right? You look at your corpus of scholarship, both journals and beyond, and it's like you're a really dynamic thinker, but this one really caught our attention. And and beyond just being a fun read and really interesting, so much of what we talk about on the podcast is relevant to or informed by not just Star Trek, of course, or Star Wars or fantasy, but like sci-fi themes and tropes. And so seeing what I think is easily one of the first papers out there arguing for ethics in space exploration, right? A very, I mean, it's a quick paper, not a quick read. It's a short paper, but it's quite comprehensive in terms of the scope you all went after. And it's not a policy paper. It's legitimately a philosophical paper, which I read in the hopes of informing policy, and that stood out. Right. So we just want to ask you about it because this is fascinating and I think just exceptionally relevant to a lot of the other stuff we talk about and we riff about, whether it's on the podcast or not.
Sure. So glad you brought me on to talk about this paper. First of all, I just want to say thank you for all your kind words. The only reason why I pop up on PBS every once in a while is because I work with Bob Hazen, who
Oh,
has had a long career of both doing cutting edge science and also being an incredible science communicator. And he was on the board of PBS Nova for many years and is
oh, that's cool.
really in
Hmm.
steeped in that community. And I'm so lucky to be his colleague and to get tapped on the shoulder every once in a while to appear on a documentary. And there will be more of that coming out, so stay tuned.
Excellent.
And then with this philosophical paper about the ethical treatment of outer space phenomena, it once again is really just a credit to the amazing colleagues that I have. This time in particular, Chelsea Haramia, Emily LaFleche, and Julia DeMarinis, we all sort of coalesced at a conference
I was wondering.
2023, May 2023, we were all at, believe it or not, a small niche conference about oxygen in planetary biospheres. So, oxygen is one of those molecules that only exists in a great abundance in our atmosphere because of photosynthetic life. And so we think that it might be a good biosignature on worlds afar. And so there was a dedicated conference just about that topic. And the amazing thing about astrobiology is that it invites so many different voices to the table because in order to understand oxygen in planetary biospheres, you have to understand something about chemistry, about atmospheric dynamics, about geology, about biology, about star-planet interactions, about how to observe using a telescope. So astronomy, these gases in exoplanet atmospheres. And then also, for some reason that was unapparent to me at the time, philosophers as well.
That's cool.
And so
Wow.
I was so struck that there would even be an ethicist at this meeting. And the great thing about small meetings is that you get to know the people there, you get to have lunches with them. And at some point, I think Emily just turned to me and said, we have to write a paper with Chelsea and Julia. And so we, I believe Chelsea gave a talk at the meeting about the ethics of SETI and METI, so the ethics of
Mhm.
searching for extraterrestrial intelligence and messaging extraterrestrial intelligence, the kind of communication that we see in Star Trek and Star Wars all the
Mhm.
time. But I think less thought has gone into the ethics of exploring planetary environments with microbial life.
Yeah.
What happens when you find microbial life on Mars or Europa or Enceladus? What happens? How do you choose to treat an environment even if it doesn't have any life whatsoever? Is it still intrinsically valuable? And so we decided to, get together and have Zoom meetings once every couple of weeks for the past couple of years, and that turned into the paper that you all read and enjoyed. And I'm just so happy that we get to discuss it today.
Yeah, okay, I got to ask a quick question. As someone who's, in some of these adjacent fields, you writing this paper, great. Publishing this paper, even better. But this is a philosophical paper that's a little bit out there, which I love. You got it in Nature.
Hmm.
Yeah.
How did you land that? Was that a hard sell during the review process?
That was so, but again, just I think a confluence of a lot of luck. So for the audience members who aren't
Yeah.
in academia or science,
Hmm.
Nature is one of the most prestigious scientific
Yeah.
journals out there. And it just so happened that a former like lab mate of ours here at Carnegie, instead of going into, continuing along being a scientist, chose a career in editing for a
Oh,
nature
cool.
journal.
Yeah.
And so through her, I got plugged into sort of the nature community and was invited to give a talk to a bunch of nature editors. So
Yep.
these are talks that they invite because they want to get sort of like what they want to know what the most exciting research is in a particular field. And so
Neat.
I was lucky enough to be tapped on the shoulder to just give a talk about what I think is the most exciting in terms of astrobiology. And of course, at the end of the talk, I spoke about for 10 minutes about a paper that we at that time were still drafting
Smart.
about astrobiology ethics. And I thought that this is one of the key frontiers in terms of thinking about how we approach space exploration and even advancing ethical knowledge through the act of imagining how we would treat extraterrestrial life. And that, out of all the things that I talked about for that entire hour, was the thing that they were like, oh, pitch us a paper about that,
Oh,
please.
neat.
So it was actually invited. I was
Nice.
first invited to give a talk, and then
Wow.
the editor reached out to me and said, "Would you like to publish your paper in Nature?" And I said, "Of course, yeah." So that's how that came to pass.
That's really cool. Thanks for sharing that openly. I think,
Mhm.
yeah, like you said, a lot. I mean, most of our listeners, well, we're assuming here, but most of our listeners, they're not familiar with the joys of the peer review process. Um, but that said, I think it's always helpful to, well, Brad, you would call it how the sausage is made, but I think
Mhm.
it's always helpful to hear about that back end of the processes of any of our successes because it demystifies this and it matters. That's cool.
Well,
Mhm,
I
mhm.
don't think people understand that you are pitched to write, you research, you write. That's not the end of it. I mean, for like, I come from the business world, there is a whole process after you write, like you said, the peer review process. Now, I've been through this writing for Jason, and so that was my first real experience coming from the business world, work writing for an academic book. Um, you know, that is a whole nother step to the process that is a tough piece. And for those who haven't done it before, um, this is, like I said, Jason says, I use the term in the business world, how the sausage is made. That is a lot of effort. And to get it into Nature, I don't think people are necessarily going to realize that amount of effort that it takes to do that. And even for someone who is very, very adjacent, I know what Nature is in terms of, I mean, that's like the kind of like the Harvard Business Review of the science
Yeah.
world.
Yeah.
So it's very impressive to do that. If you don't mind, I'm gonna ask a very remedial question just for the folks that don't necessarily understand that, and I apologize for it. But from a peer review perspective, when you're doing something in Nature, when you're publishing something for Nature, what was the peer review process like for that?
Good question. So this was a Nature comment article. So it
Yeah.
was in sort of the front matter of the physical journal. And so for those articles, because they're not really a scientific study, with like data that needs to be presented and then argued, the interpretation needs to be argued for, it wasn't peer reviewed by other scientists. It went through an editorial process with the
Hmm.
editors of Nature.
That makes
And so
sense.
they had a lot of comments about, the way to present these arguments, and went through several different drafts, and our group has been discussing a lot of different principles of astrobiology ethics, and the paper that we initially submitted after we were invited to put something into Nature was quite a bit different in topic, actually, than what eventually
Mm.
came out. Because for one of these commentary articles, what they said was it should be there to provoke further discussion.
Yeah.
So you want
Excellent.
to put out a bold idea and
Hmm.
you want to defend that idea, but you want to just leave it out there for everybody to sort of discuss and continue that discussion. And so initially we had a lot of, we've got philosophers on our team, right? And philosophers are often very careful about their words and also very careful about developing their thoughts in very, to be honest, long-winded kinds of treatises, because they like to present an argument from somebody else, spend a lot of time tearing that apart, and then present their argument and how it solves all of the things that were wrong, that was wrong with the previous argument. We couldn't do that in a 2,000 to 3,000 Nature comment. And so what we did was we just threw our ideas out there for an updated and more expansive taxonomy of moral value in the cosmos, gave examples of what those things might look like, and then a few quick recommendations for the community, like that scientists and philosophers should work together more, and it should be encouraged within academic disciplines to have that kind of interdisciplinary collaboration, and that space agencies especially should embed more
Hmm.
philosophical and ethical thought into their practices.
Okay, so toward that end, let me just read a few sentences. I'm hopping around here. I'm just going
Okay.
to pull out the ones, and this is perfect. Thanks for teeing me up like this so well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But the ones that stood out toward the end, to your point here, so that everyone can hear this. And it's really, I mean, I'm not paraphrasing. This is verbatim, but just a few lines that stood out to me toward the end. To your point, and I quote, but decisions must be made with ethical goals operating alongside scientific, commercial, and political goals, so that the societal and ethical implications of research can keep up with the pace of discovery. Love this part. Philosophical specialists should be embedded long term with active scientists and interdisciplinary teams. And then the closing, which I love, working together across the sciences and the humanities. We hope to pave the way to a future full of not just discovery, but also prosperity based on sound moral principles, which is so lovely, Mike. And for those not versed in environmental ethics or environmental policy or commercial space law and all that, like especially that last closing sentence, what do you embed there? What do you hint at there? There's a lot there, and it is provocative, and hopefully it will generate a lot of discussion.
Yeah, yeah. So I think with that last sentence, because we're speaking mostly to a scientific readership
Yeah.
here, right? We're
Hmm.
publishing in Nature, so scientists are going to read this. Scientists obviously have their goals and the things that they value: scientific discovery, making new breakthroughs, learning more about the universe. Other people in space exploration, especially on the commercial and the political side, have different goals. They want to, I don't know, make money or get famous or land on Mars and build some kind of settlement
Right.
or advance national interests, things like that.
Yep.
And with this article, especially toward the end, what we wanted to say is, in addition to all of those things that we worry about when we decide how to act in outer space, we should also choose to promote ethical values as well. And scientists, politicians, and commercial enterprises may not, without a little bit of nudging, choose to prioritize ethical values in addition to scientific value, national prestige, commercial output, etc. And so that's the kind of thing that we want to highlight here with this is that if we don't pay attention to scholarly research and invite the voices from the humanities, from philosophy, from ethics, then we're almost certain to fail in terms of promoting and choosing to optimize for ethical value in concert with all of these other things that we want to glean from outer space exploration.
Can I ask just again, I'm the super adjacent guy of the three of us here. Um, in terms of this type of discussion, and Jason knows this, I'm big into ethics and compassion and empathy, and interjecting that into areas like in the business world where it without commentary is severely lacking. Um, you know, did you talked about this a little bit, but is this topic something that is this paper something that really has kind of been kind of a trailblazer in terms of a discussion topic? Has this really been something that hasn't really been fully discussed before or really at the forefront of discussion, in terms of space travel and everything? Do you feel like you've kind of like opened a door? And I'm not trying to I'm not trying to make you like toot your own horn or anything like that, but I'm just trying to, be very transparent and say it feels like you have really, like, by putting this in Nature, really opened a door for something that really hasn't really been talked about fully.
Yeah, well, I think, that is up to the rest of the community to decide. It's not something that, I can speak to immediately right now. I know folks are interested in, having us speak, coming on this podcast, for instance, to talk about the paper or go to conferences to speak about these types of things or give seminars about it. I think the ethical treatment of outer space phenomena is not a new subject that we, just brought up out of the blue with this paper earlier this year. But I think we do try to do something new in terms of promoting this expansive taxonomy of moral value in outer space. A lot of previous thought has gone into trying to figure out, okay, is a microbe on Mars intrinsically valuable? Like there's this long-standing debate in philosophy about what entities, what objects, what systems are intrinsically valuable, which means valuable in and of themselves, existing just for their own sake, versus a kind of value called instrumental value, which means it is valuable because it does something for something else. So a great example of something that's only instrumentally valuable is money. All by itself, a dollar bill doesn't have any value. It only gains its value because it is used in human to human exchanges. Whereas a human is definitely intrinsically valuable. Just being itself is, a source of value. And so we see this sort of like dichotomy between things with intrinsic value and things that don't have intrinsic value in like a lot of classic thought, and so people have debated, where should we draw the line between things with intrinsic value and things without? Some people might draw the line at life, anything like a bacterium and up sort of has intrinsic value. Other people might slide it all the way up to like humans because of our seemingly unique capacities for rational thought and intelligence, whatever that means, and sociality. But I think no matter where you decide to draw this line, you're operating on sort of like a very one-dimensional hierarchy of moral value. But I don't know if that's necessarily the way the universe is put together with just like one sliding scale. Instead, there may be many different kinds of attributes that can contribute to a system's moral value. And so that's what we try to advocate here through our new taxonomy that includes things like relational value and systemic value and uniqueness, things that in previous writing may have been alluded to, but we try to really nail it down here in this taxonomy that we promote. And through that lens, that allows you to see how very different entities can have moral value for different reasons. And so in our paper, we've got this quote about how it's often in planetary science people will say like Mars is a failed planet. Why do we think Mars is a failed planet? Well, it's because it doesn't have certain attributes that Earth has, like plate tectonics, active geologic cycles, an ocean, a thick atmosphere, and of course, a biosphere that is at play on its surface. But, seeing what is special about Earth is one thing, but then concluding that just because Earth is special in certain ways means that it is the only special thing out there is, we think, a mistake. And so, just as we don't condemn Earth for failing to be a gas giant or a star, we shouldn't condemn a gas giant or a star or Mars for failing to be like Earth. They can have their own moral value, their own richness in different ways from the way that our planet and our life on our planet exhibits moral value.
Okay, so I want to move us in a moment in a direction of just riffing for some fun, kind of looking at the future, maybe just asking together, playing with what if. But before I do that, because you went to Mars, so I have to ask
Mhm.
this. I remember, here's my contextualization for this, for picking your brain about this. I remember, I want to say it was 97. Don't quote, I think it was about 97. You were younger, Mike, but I remember in 97 very clearly, and Brad will too, that I think that was when the Allen Hills meteorite papers came out. I'm pretty sure it was 97. I was
96,
well,
96,
it
yeah.
was 96. Okay.
Hmm.
I thought
Hmm.
I was wrong about that. Okay. I had literally just started grad school. I had graduated a couple months before I was taking my first grad class to get into my master's. Right. Okay. So it was a transitional time. So okay, great. 96, even when you were younger. Um and that meteorite, the findings, which were, I mean, obviously really questionable, right? Like how do you really with any certainty agree that there's life anywhere else when it's technically indirect? But whatever, it was a remarkable set of findings, no matter what, whether we found life or not. It was a remarkable set of findings. President Clinton at the time spoke about it from the Rose Garden, and I remember driving around Milwaukee. Brad, this will date us, Brad, but I remember driving around Milwaukee, listening to this on Wisconsin Public Radio as I was like heading to class. Like, my God, like I don't want to get my hopes up. Okay. And most of the evidence in, a couple decades of hindsight, oh my God, in a few decades of hindsight suggests that, okay, that could have been it. It probably wasn't, but it could have been. Who knows? But as we're recording, and especially since we're doing this backwards, so this episode is going to drop tomorrow anyways. So as we're recording, um, another paper just came out. I haven't read it yet. Maybe you have, maybe you haven't. Um, with a lot stronger evidence that there might have been ancient, we should say, microbial life on Mars, or something that obviously everyone's been wondering about. Um, as a psychologist, I can have thoughts, just as a generalist scientist, if you will. You just happen to be an astrobiologist, right? So I'm just curious, before we kind of riff about the future and maybe where this stuff will go, I'm curious if we can get your hot take, if you will. And I'm not asking you like to put this down on paper, like, oh, see, we're gonna come back in 5 years and tell you you were right or wrong. But like, what's your sense right now from the evidence? Do you have one?
Yeah, so that's such a good question. Wow. We're closing in on 30 years since
Right.
the Allen Hills meteorite discovery,
Absolutely. Yeah.
with the possible forms of microbial life on Mars. And just to touch on that before getting to the more
Yeah, please.
recent stuff. Yeah, I remember like my mom showing me
Yeah, you're not
that
helping, but
discovery
keep
in,
going.
in the
Yeah.
newspaper. Yeah, I was like, oh my God. Like actually that was one of the things that it was one of the first times I remember thinking that space was really cool
Oh,
and that
that's
that was
cool.
something I wanted to do.
Yeah.
Um and I feel like that in addition to Star Trek was a catalyst for my And it was honestly talking to people in the field now a catalyst for the entire field of astrobiology. So
Hmm.
even though most astrobiologists today would say that that meteorite does not actually contain evidence of past
Right.
life on Mars, it drummed up so much excitement in the
Hmm.
community that we could be that close to actually making a discovery because we have the scientific techniques now
Right.
to make these kinds of investigations. And so that kicked off, a whole line of Mars research that we sent the Mars exploration rovers Spirit and Opportunity in the early 2000s, and followed by Curiosity, which landed on Mars in 2012, a robotic geologist to try to
Hmm.
identify whether or not Mars was actually habitable for life. And then when we found, yes, indeed, we sent the Perseverance rover, the Mars 2020 mission, which is the latest one. And it's been actually trying to identify the most promising rock samples to bring back to Earth so that we can analyze those rocks and try to identify signs of life there. So it's probably not going to be able to make a definitive detection of life, but identify essentially what are called possible biosignatures or potential biosignatures. Some people call them ambiguous biosignatures because they on Earth could be indicative of life, but of course, Mars is a different place from Earth, and there might be different geological processes that could result in those features as well. So, anyway, the buzz from like 2 weeks ago
Yeah.
was that the Perseverance rover, whose mission again is to look for the most interesting and promising rocks to bring back to Earth for searching for signs of life, identified one such promising outcrop. And in summary, they found organic matter, so carbon-rich matter, and life as we know it is carbon-based. No offense to the Horta or anything like that, but
Hmm.
we're mostly looking for carbon-based life.
Hmm.
So finding organics would seem to be a prerequisite. Okay, check that box. But then more interesting than that is that they found these interesting in science we call them redox states of the minerals in those rocks. And so one thing that life is known to do, and probably all life in the universe will do, is influence its environment by essentially shuttling electrons around. All life, especially life that lives like microbial life that lives within rocks, make a living, they're shuttling electrons between different minerals in those rocks. And so they change the mineralogy in a certain predictable way. And it looks like in this rock formation, life could have been responsible for the kinds of patterns in these redox states in these minerals. And so that's what makes it so exciting. Is it a slam dunk for life? No, but it makes us really want to bring that sample back. And if, funding happens and we have the willpower to make it so, maybe one day we will have that rock sample in our laboratories here on Earth to make some kind of more definitive statement as to whether or not there was ancient microbial life on Mars. But as for right now, all we have is that very tantalizing sign. It's still a maybe, but it's great. It's a great leap forward in our search for life.
Excellent. Thanks for that. Okay, so with that, then let's just riff for a few minutes if you don't mind. Let's go maybe leave the science a bit, talk a little more about sci-fi. Have some fun with that because we know
Okay.
you are hardcore about all of that. So, and I can say I'll just preface by saying I'm not yet not currently funded by any federal grants, so I might be able to say a few things without fear of repercussion in 2025. So put that out there. Um, we can look at like let's look over the next century of space exploration, of space, robotic, crewed, etc., of maybe moving into the solar system. Okay. But we start here at home, like in the States in
I should
2025.
preface
What?
there's a new game coming
Oh,
out.
there's
Yeah,
yeah, that's fair.
there's a
But
there's a new game coming out, a new
I
RPG coming out that is about spreading out amongst
oh
the
yeah,
solar system. And
are you familiar? Have you been following any of the news or the upcoming Kickstarter for Mongoose's Pioneer RPG?
No, sorry,
yeah,
I
No, no,
haven't.
it's we heard about it uh from Matthew Sprange, their CEO when we talked with him last when we and this was a couple of years ago or close to it
about a
or
year
a
ago.
year ago, I'm sorry. So I've been
This
like
has been
talk
on his mind.
it's been on
We
my
have to
mind for a
preface
year.
Michael's.
Um
That's why it's coming
but
up
if you
because
Google it, there's a Kickstarter coming out. It sounds absolutely fascinating. Its lead writer is an astronomer. Like they're getting serious about this. But I would be asking this regardless, because this is like where my mind is. And I've been thinking about this a lot lately. So Mars sample return. We have all of those amazing samples cached on the surface. And honestly, at this point, no real plan, actual plan to bring them back. I mean, we know how like it's probably going to be done, but we don't, and we know that it's not going to be done anytime soon, right? Like that timeline has slipped, to put it nicely. Artemis, which I'm still really excited about, right? In Artemis 2, we know there aren't going to be Americans on the lunar surface at least until Artemis 3. Hopefully, Artemis 3 continues. Meanwhile, like the whole Chang'e mission design out of China, like they are trailblazing like crazy. Like in right in a handful of years, they've basically gone from never been there to now almost catching up with us short of crewed. Like it's amazing what China's doing, right? And having their station in orbit right now and constantly crewed like the landscape, that's a terrible word to use, but the landscape and whatever is shifting. India is rapidly developing technology. Now, I don't know if we're going to have some kind of Cold War, if you will, where competition will once again motivate. But I say all of this, and I apologize for droning, but I say all of this because when it comes to policy and ethics and whatnot, looking like in the coming years, decades, even even the next century or the coming century, like things are shifting, and it's so relevant to your paper and some of the other work you and your colleagues have done that it's 2025. Let's fast forward to 2055, and we're all off the record. No one's going to lose any funding or be held accountable to these decisions or these thoughts, all of which will invariably prove incorrect. But like 2055 is going to look different in our solar system than, 1975 did. And what we know is probably going to be just astounding and more wonderful than any of us can imagine. But that said, things are changing, and like each of the countries and each of the consortia which are moving out into space or hoping to move out into space, they have they have different ethical, moral baselines, right? They have different goals in terms of expansion, in terms of in-situ resource utilization, all of that. So putting on your just playing sci-fi cap, Mike, like what are your thoughts? What are your excitements? What are your concerns? Like when you look decades and decades out, what like really gets you thinking about what's all of this going to, I know that's a big cloud, but like what's this going to look like? Like what stands out to you? I have my things, but what stands out to you? Like looking decades and decades and decades into the future.
Wow, Jason. I what a question. I
Wahaha.
mean, I let me just preface this by saying that I don't even know how to look 5 years into the future. I'm writing
Fair.
these faculty applications right now. I'm a postdoc, right? So I'm being asked to essentially map out
Yeah.
my future years and decades as a scientist,
Yeah.
and I have such a hard time doing that. Why? Because
It's
when I
impossible.
look 5 years in the other direction, 5 years ago, could I
Yep.
have predicted any of the projects that I'm working on right now, including astrobiology ethics? No, absolutely
Mm.
not. These things happen so spontaneously and unpredictably, and making predictions about the future is something that I am very much still a novice at. But I'll try to answer your question
Yeah, not
the best way I
predictions,
can.
just like
Yeah.
thoughts, quandaries, things like that.
Well, I think, again, one of the things that we are very concerned with is the rising trend of commercial space enterprises. Now, don't get me wrong. Entities like SpaceX are extraordinarily good at what they do in terms of building rocketry that reliably and reusably, sustainably get us into space, and our access to outer space environments has never been better. But one thing that I see right now that is concerning to me is a lack of realization that NASA and SpaceX are very different entities. And it's not like, some people might be wondering, well, we have SpaceX now. Why do our taxpayer dollars have to go to continue to fund this aging space agency called NASA? And, SpaceX, like I said, is really good at doing the thing that it does, but it isn't really the reason that we choose to go to space right now. You know, they can build rockets, but the reason why traditionally that we've gone to space over the past many decades is for knowledge making, for curiosity, for satisfying that itch as an exploratory species and understanding better our place in the universe. That's what NASA does. NASA builds scientific instrumentation, space probes to explore everywhere from the sulfuric acid clouds of Venus to the distant, dwarf planet Pluto, and unveil these incredible new environments that help us reflect on our own place in the cosmos. And so what I see in terms of, to use the word, landscape shifting right now is prioritizing these commercial gains over the scientific exploration, or not even realizing that, scientific exploration is something that we're really good at, and in the future, if that continues to go, then we're going to see space essentially as a playground for a very small subset of humanity that whose outputs don't necessarily raise the sense of awe and wonder and community and togetherness, and even perhaps some kind of spiritual feelings about who we are. And I would rather not see us go to Mars just to build hotels for the uber rich, or to plant flags for nation states here on Earth, but really to just increase our sense of wonder as humanity. And that's sort of one of the driving forces, I think, behind the reason why we wrote the paper that we wrote.
Yeah, I think the challenge, coming from the business world, the privatization of space travel we have right now versus, scientific space travel, I'm seeing it, and I think this is what you're saying, and I'm going to say it probably in a very simple way. So, my worry is that from looking at it from the business world, there is always a challenge. Let me rephrase that. In many ways, and in a lot of ways, there's always a challenge of ethics and morality when you introduce that. And my worry or concern is that that's going to permeate, and it already is starting to permeate. And how is that going to affect? And that's why I think your paper is so important, because it's that type of discussion is going to abut against, and it's going to come up against the moving train of the business of space travel. And without, and again, without, getting into like the individual space companies or anything like that, because we could go into we could pick those private companies and have a discussion about each one of them individually right now, and we could go for hours on it. But it's not always the science of space, the science that's driving. It's not the science that's driving them right now.
Yep.
And that's a major concern. I think there can be a coexistence of that, and that's just not what's occurring. And I don't see that unless the topics that your paper has introduced continues. And I hate to say it, in the business world, greed drives, money drives.
Well, I mean, then there's if it's a corporation, there's a responsibility legally to shareholders.
Yeah. Well, even if it's private,
Yeah.
even if it's private, the greed drives, and it's a cycle, and ownership group or owner wants to make money.
Mm-hmm.
So even if the shareholder is that person or a ownership group, and not a stockholder. So, when your paper came out, I thought this is going to be interesting, and I think it's a good discussion to have, especially as we see this privatization. And I hope we do not completely yield, to privatization, as much as I think capitalism is important. We're on a very slippery slope right now.
Joseph.
Sorry, I ranted, and I didn't need to do that with you on
No,
here.
it's good.
Well,
We all feel it.
yeah, we feel it, and yeah, completely acknowledge that, Brad. Now, Jason, you sent me a couple of papers that you had written a few years ago, and I had the pleasure of reading through them
Wasting your time. Thank you.
recently.
Yeah.
And you, one thing I really love about you is how optimistic you are, how you're always putting a positive spin on everything. And so, in the paper that you titled Artemis and an environmentally sustainable future beyond Earth, you talk about how thinking about and trying to develop sustainable futures in space is an opportunity to just rethink how we interact with nature in general and how people can try to learn to develop and maintain what you call empathy for nature. And I was hoping that you could riff a little bit on that a little bit
Well,
more. How do you imagine us developing this greater sense of empathy for nature?
I mean, that's very kind of you, Mike. We don't have you. You don't have to do that. We don't have to. I appreciate. I'll answer the question briefly, but that's very kind of. Thank you. We don't have to do that. We're here to talk to you and geek
Oh,
out with you. But
sorry. My own podcast host has snuck in, and I'm
no,
starting to
no,
ask
no,
No, no,
you
no,
the
no, no, you're
questions.
good.
we're going there next. Don't worry. We want you to
Okay.
pitch that hard. Because we love your podcast. No, I appreciate that. It's you just have to be optimistic. I mean, and I don't mean that. Like I consider myself an optimist by default. Anyone who know, yeah, I'm getting the look from Brad. Anyone who knows me.
No, I know you.
Oh,
I know
oh,
you are.
actually, I was gonna say the reality is I'm probably not. I in reality, I am what you might call an optimistic realist. Like I had a colleague I had back in the day at a former institution, um our STEM dean. He was a really neat guy. And he would and then he went into consulting and he would tell people with this huge grin, which was legit. I am an inveterate optimist. Well, I can't be an inveterate optimist in 2025, but I'm also not, right? Because that's not how the cosmos works. It's much more nuanced and complex, much like one of your recent papers as well. Um, but uh, but I think I'm deeply involved. Most of my research is around right, like nature and its benefits and whatnot. And to me, like there are real opportunities for bringing that with us as we go. But even more importantly, this is personally why your paper resonated so strongly with me, particularly that we are going to be encountering these amazing natural environments from which we can learn, from which we can grow, develop, maybe even evolve as a species. And I think you and your colleagues would agree with this, but which I would argue strongly, which require our ethical protection, whatever that ends up meaning. And so I've riffed a little bit about that in a few papers. You guys talk a whole lot about that. This has been addressed in a number, I say a number, like less than a dozen, right? This has been addressed in a number of papers, most of them in the past 20 years, most of them uh, policy or philosophical, often though written by scientists. But what I love is kind of like Brad said, but you got yours into nature. And so this is the first one. I don't mean that just as a pat on the back, that this is maybe the first time a paper in that arena is not niche. And that's
Hmm.
important. That's a big deal. I mean, we can talk more about my stuff offline. I will say though, I find this stuff so compelling. Brad knows this, and a little bit to her chagrin, my wife knows this. That I think increasingly I want to like even professionally go in toward like environmental slash space policy. Like like we'll see after my girls get out of college. There's a degree program I've got my eyes on. Okay, more importantly, you do happen to host a podcast,
Uh-huh.
which we love. It does not come out sufficiently frequently, but we still love it. You are a busy individual. But pitch it. Like a lot of our listeners undoubtedly are familiar with it, not just from you being on the podcast before, but tell us about your podcast and whatever you want them to know.
Yeah, Strange New Worlds, a science and Star Trek podcast. Basically, this is something I started a number of years ago, just as Star Trek Discovery was coming out, and I was listening to a bunch of other Star Trek podcasts at the time, and people were talking about the characters and the story arcs and everything, including the costuming and the set design. But nobody was talking about the science. And so I decided one day to just try to fill that niche myself and talk about the science that we were seeing on screen, not just in Discovery, but across all the different Star Trek series. And it's really been a fun project of mine, just blossomed into talking to all sorts of different scientist nerds about the science of Star Trek, and even some of the folks who were on the other side of creating Star Trek, some of the actors who have portrayed science officers and writers and things like that. And it's been a blast. I do it when I have time in my spare time, so there's no regular release schedule, as you know. If you've been following, sometimes I can go a month where I put out 4 episodes. Sometimes there will be 2 months where I don't put out any episodes, and it just depends on how busy I am with my work. Because I don't want it to feel like work. I want it to just be, something that I enjoy doing when I have the space in my life to do it. And I got to say, I think the next couple of episodes will be inspired by this great book that I happened to read called Second Star to the Right, Essays on Leadership in Star Trek.
With which you're familiar.
Yeah, so I read chapter 5, and I'm really, really, really proud of that. Thank you, Jason, and also to your colleague Aaron Peterson for inviting me to do that. It was a challenge for me because I didn't know what I could contribute, but you believing in me helped me craft this story about my mentoring philosophy through the lens of Star Trek Lower Decks, which is like honestly my favorite Star Trek series. It's really fun. And then I'm reading through the other chapters now that the book has been published, and I'm thinking about how to spin those into
Cool.
some podcast episodes. So yeah, you can look forward to that in the near future.
Good. And also, for those who haven't yet been listening to your podcast, because they should be, I mean, it's obviously a science and Star Trek podcast, but like you said, I want to double down on this. It matters. There's a lot more than quote just science, right? That brings in a lot of us, but like you've been doing a lot in terms of science reporting, right? You've been partnering lately. Like it's not just you, and it's not even always just interviews. There have been a lot of dialogues in
Mhm.
recent episodes. And I think, and I mean this in a really complimentary way, it's really, really accessible.
Thank
You
you.
guys are going after wonderfully complex things, typically that are coming out of the episodes, but then you're breaking them down in a very down to earth way, which like if you're a gamer, if you're a writer, whatever, like people can listen to your discussions. And because this happens to me, even though I don't write fiction and I just like, oh, neat, and then I go on with my life. But like if you're looking for ways to understand some of these concepts, if you're looking for ideas, like I can see people listening to a bunch of those episodes, Mike, and thinking like, okay, that's the seed. I'm gonna go write my thing now. So it's very cool. Keep doing it.
Wow, thank you so much. Yeah, that's far too kind, but I
Mm,
really appreciate it.
yeah. All right.
Yeah,
Well,
you
okay,
don't
go.
have to be, I was just gonna say, you don't have to be a scientist.
No.
You do not have to be a scientist
Mm.
to listen to it. I'm not your traditional scientist, and I enjoy listening to it. It's,
You're not
so
even a non-traditional scientist.
yeah, and I didn't say, and I didn't say it at Holiday Inn
No,
Express last night.
that's right. Very good. Yeah.
Um, so yeah, it's definitely one that, put it on your playlist and listen to it,
Oh,
even if it has nothing to do with Second Star to the Right.
because there's
So
always Star Trek. Mike, thanks so
yeah,
much for coming back. We always love talking about it. It's really kind of you to come back. So pleased we could have this discussion and talk about your paper.
Oh, thank you both for having me. This was a blast, and yeah, looking forward to the next time.
You got it.